What's up guys, Asian here with a build video, and today we're going to be discussing the Magicka Nightblade. This is going to be a 5-4-2 setup, so we're going to be doing one 5-piece with a 4-piece Minor Slayer set and then a 2-piece Monster Helm set. So this is that setup for this Magicka Nightblade. It's a pretty easy set to obtain compared to some other sets out there. You won't need to necessarily farm for any sort of material. Your 5-piece is going to be fairly easily obtainable. It's really just going to be getting that final 4-piece is going to be the tricky part here. So just like our other build videos, we're going to be starting off with gear, and then we'll go over our skills, and then CP allocation. And after that, we will be going over the rotation, kind of the prioritization of skills, and then I'll finish things off with the 6 million dummy parse and try to narrate through the rotation and the parse, so you guys can get an idea of what you should be doing during a parse, in a raid and elsewhere. So starting things off here with our gear, so for our Monster Helm we're going with Zaan. The thing with Zaan is you need to be within 10 meters of the boss in order to get it to actually deal all the damage. Zaan currently is the strongest Monster Helm in the game. It outparses Grothar and melee range, and it outparses Skoria and Alambris at range. But again, that 10 meter radius is the main deciding factor here. So I would still carry around a set of Skorias, but Zaan will outparse Skoria. So if you're going to do trials and fights where you're going to be pretty much up close against the boss, for example, pretty much all the bosses in Ethereum Archive, a lot of the bosses, pretty much all the Craglorn trials, you're going to be pretty much right up against the boss, so Zaan will make a very good use there. But in fights where you have a lot of mobility involved, for example, in Maw, a lot of the fights in Maw, you're going to be moving around a lot, or the boss will be moving around a lot. And in Asylum and Sanctorium, where you or the boss are going to be moving around a lot, Zaan's obviously not going to be nearly as strong as in the Vet Craglorn trials. So in those situations, you would want to use something like Skoria instead of Zaan. If you are going to be using Zaan, because the 1-piece is a spell crit and not max health, Skoria, the 1-piece gives you max health, so you don't necessarily have to worry about this. If you are using Zaan, you will need to use a max health enchant on a large piece, because you will be using Witchmother's Potent Brew, or the gold Clockwork City food. I don't have it here on me because I am on the PTS. I don't give you that on the PTS, but you will need a max health enchant. Now, if you are going to be using blue food instead, so max health, max magicka, you don't need the health enchant. You can just stick with all magicka enchants. But if you will be using Zaan with Witchmothers, you will need a health enchant on one of your large pieces in order to get a reasonable amount of health. For our 5-piece effect, we're going with Julianos, a tried and true staple set for Magicka DPS. This is a crafted set. 6 traits are required for any piece you want to make. You do need access to the Hrothgar DLC, or know somebody who has access to the Hrothgar DLC, or has the attuned crafting station at their house. You can kind of play around with the armor weights depending on how lucky you are with Zaan drops or Skoria drops. Ideally, if you want to max out your resistances truly min-max, you're going to want a heavy chest. But again, that kind of depends on your RNG factor, which weight, shoulders, and helm you get first for your Monster Helm. But you can do a little bit of playing around there. All of our armor pieces are divines. We do have all max magicka enchants, except for if you're using Zaan with Witchmothers, you want a 1 health enchant on a large piece. For our jewelry, we're going with Master Architect. You can use any of the Minor Slayer sets, so Moondancer or Infallible Aether. We have all spell damage enchants. Magicka Nightblades have very good sustain, so you don't need to necessarily worry about adding in a regen glyph, unlike for Storks or even Templars. So we can go with all spell damage glyphs here. If you don't have the Minor Slayer sets farmed up yet, you can go with Willpower instead. 3-piece Willpower is a pretty powerful combination until you manage to get your Minor Slayer sets. IA pulls just a little bit lower compared to Master Architect and Moondancer, even on a Nightblade, but the difference is pretty small, so just go with whatever set you manage to get first. For our front bar, we're going with the Master Architect Inferno Staff infused with a flame damage enchant. Again, depending on which staff set you get first, you can use IA or Moondancer. If you are using Willpower, you can go with a Julianos Inferno Staff or any old crafted Inferno Staff. The important thing is to make sure it's infused and it has a fire damage enchant. For our back bar, we have a Maelstrom Inferno Staff, also infused with a weapon damage enchant. So we're kind of seeing the shift away from Lightning Staff back bars with Dragonbone, so we're going to go with the Inferno Staff instead here. If you don't have an Inferno staff, you can go again with any old crafted Inferno staff. Just remember it needs to be infused with a weapon damage enchant. So that's pretty much it for gear here. For attributes, because we're going with double Inferno, Dark Elves are going to be the best race. You can go with other Magicka inclined races, so Altmer, the High Elves, Bretons, you can go with Argonians as well. The Argonians have a nice boost to their sustain because of the potion passive that they have, but they're generally going to pull overall less DPS compared to the other three classes, the races that I mentioned earlier. We have all of our points are in Magicka. We can put a couple points into health with Witchmothers and 1 health enchant on your back bar. You have 16,360 health. And swap to our front bar, we have 16,815 health. So if you want to give yourself a little bit more survivability, you can shift a couple of points from Magicka into health. I wouldn't really put more than 4 or 5 points though, because you don't want to sacrifice too much into your Magicka pool. For our Mundus stone, we're going with the Apprentice. With a fully optimized raid group, Apprentice is going to generally pull higher than the Lover, but if you aren't using things like Alkosh, you might want to use Lover instead for your raid group. It all depends on whether using Lover will push you above the penetration cap of 18,200. So with the Lover and all your debuffs up, if you are still underneath the penetration cap, then Lover will outperform Apprentice. However, in fully optimized raid groups, basically if you have Alkosh, essentially, the Apprentice will generally pull higher when the Alkosh debuff is up. So you're going to have to figure this out with your own raid group and see whether you want to use the Apprentice or the Lover. So I am using Witchmother's Potent Brew, which gives us Magicka regen, max Magicka, and max health. There is another food that you can purchase off of guild traders or make yourself. It is I believe it's Clockwork citrus Filet or something like that. It's a gold food, so it does use Perfect Row. It does give you a little bit better stats, plus it gives you additional health regen, which helps out if you decide to be a vampire. I'm not a vampire here, but you can be a vampire for the added sustain if you'd like. But that's kind of up to you. It is fairly expensive to make because it does use Perfect Row. So for the people who don't want to spend all that money purchasing Perfect Row and crafting the food, Witchmother's is a perfectly fine alternative. Now onto our skill sets. For our front bar, we're going with Impale, Funnel Health, Twisting Path, Merciless Resolve, Inner Light, and we have the Destruction Staff ulti here, Fiery Rage. We need to have Fiery Rage here as our ultimate because we don't have any Destruction Staff abilities on our front bar otherwise, and we do want to have that Ancient Knowledge passive. So in order to have the Ancient Knowledge passive, you need to have a Destruction Staff ability slotted, so that's why we have the Destruction Staff ulti on the front bar. For our back bar, I'm using Elemental Drain just for purposes of the parse, but you would be using your shield here, either Dampen Magic or Harness Magicka. It's kind of up to you which one you want to use. Dampen Magic will give you better shields, will give you more survivability, but Harness Magicka will give you better sustain as long as you're getting hit by spell damage when your shield is up. So it's kind of up to you which one you want to pick. I like Dampen for a little bit more survivability because, again, Nightblades have very good sustain, so you don't necessarily need that extra sustain. So I prefer Dampen on my Magicka Nightblades. Crippling Grasp, Blockade of Fire, Siphoning Attacks, Inner Light again, and then we have Soul Harvest here. Soul Harvest, you're not really going to be using this as an ultimate, except maybe during Execute. It kind of depends on how you want to play out with it. Generally speaking, Soul Harvest is here when you're on your back bar, killing trash mobs in order to get more ultimate for the next boss fight. One thing I do want to note is you can swap out Crippling Grasp for the other morph. Here, Debilitate if you'd like. Debilitate does deal slightly less DPS overall. You can see here with the morphs, Crippling Grasp does deal a little bit more damage compared to Debilitate. However, Debilitate can be applied to multiple enemies, so that's really helpful for trash pulls or when the boss is moving around a lot, so you might want to, reapply Crippling Grasp for whatever reason, or Debilitate. Plus, when you have an enemy die who is affected by Debilitate, you get some Magicka back, so it's nice for your sustain a little bit there. But you can pick whichever one you want. I stick with Crippling Grasp, but Debilitate does have its merits in trash fights, especially in fights like via the Craglorns and Maw, where the trash can be kind of a time sink. Onward to CPs. Now, due to the change in the off-balance changes, we will have different blue CPs compared to Clockwork City. Starting off with our green CPs, we have 75 in Arcanist, 75 into Tenacity. And then the remaining 90 points can be put into these next 3 nodes wherever you'd like. I prefer a balanced approach, but realistically you can kind of put them wherever you'd like, as long as you have 75 into both of these nodes. So I have 31 to Shadow Ward and Tumbling, and then I have 28 into Warlord. That just helps conserve stamina for cases where you do need to use a break free a lot, or where you need to block cast very often. Again, you can kind of play around with these. For example, if you want the Treasure Hunter passive here, you can put 75 points into here, and then put the remaining points into Warlord if you'd like. For our blue CPs, this particular CP setup is optimized for the raid group that I run with, so I run with a group that only uses Torog's Infused Crusher. We aren't using Alkosh. We're kind of looking into it due to the changes in synergies and Dragon Bones, but we still haven't ultimately decided if we want to run Alkosh or not on our off-tank. So for right now, this is with an Infused Torog's Crusher. Again, the important thing to remember here is, does putting points into Spell Erosion put you over the penetration cap? Generally speaking, Magicka DPS are going to need to put a couple of points into Spell Erosion, even with Torog's and Alkosh procs happening. You'd still need a couple of points into Spell Erosion, so just keep that in mind. Just try to meet the penetration cutoff of 18,200 as best as you can. I have 56 into Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert, 42 into Spell Erosion, 16 into Staff Expert, 66 into Master at Arms, and then 11 into Thaumaturge. So for the blue CPs, again, it's going to vary depending on the specific debuffs, if your group is using Alkosh or not. But you can take some points out of Spell Erosion if you don't need them there. Start putting them into things like Elemental Expert. And Thaumaturge, it kind of depends how you want to go around doing that. I would recommend using Constellations here, which is the one I have. Just do a parse on a 3 million dummy, or take a raid parse, import your comment metrics, and then just calculate out your optimal CP distributions here. Do keep in mind, if you are using Constellations, you will need to put in the spell penetration here, so you're going to have to calculate that out specifically. With the new comment metrics, I believe it does the spell penetration for you, but it still doesn't import it on the Constellation, so that's something you want to keep in mind there. Finally, for our red CPs, this is again going to vary depending on the content you're running. I prefer a one-size-fits-most distribution, but it's kind of up to you. I have 48 into Ironclad, 40 into Thick-Skinned, 1 light armor focus, 56 into Hardy, Elemental Defender, and then I like 31 points into Bastion. For the Infusion passive, that's really nice, especially as a DPS, because you're going to be doing most of the rezzing. So this helps out your Magicka DPS get their resources back a little bit faster. Plus, it just helps the effectiveness of your damage shields. So that's pretty much it for the gear and all the kind of nitty-gritty. So now we're going on to our rotation. So I'm going to just go over to this dummy here to kind of demonstrate what the rotation will ultimately look like. So again, depending on, so there's basically 2 ways you can play Magicka Nightblades. You can basically go with a prioritization on the bow proc, which is your Merciless Resolve, or you can go with a more static rotation and kind of just use the bow proc however it happens. Because Merciless now retains the stacks as long as you're in combat, you can go with either one of them. Obviously, prioritizing your bow procs will give you higher DPS compared to a static rotation, but that's kind of up to you. If you're just starting to learn how to play Nightblade, you might want to stick with the static rotation and just overcast your Twisting Path. And that's kind of up to you. So generally what you want to do is you want to make sure you're buffed up with Merciless and Siphoning attacks. Start off with your Destro Staff ulti, and then layer dots. Always start off with Blockade, and then Grasp, and then Path, and then just Light Weave. So I prefer to prioritize my bow proc, like so, and then you just re-up your buffs whenever they run out. So this ends up being a dynamic rotation because Twisting Path has a 12-second duration compared to the 8-second duration of Blockade and Crippling Grasp. So that's what the rotation looks like. That's a dynamic rotation. If you're looking for a more static rotation, I'm just going to let my Magicka get back up. I'll heavy attack to get my Magicka back up. So if you're looking for a more static rotation, it's basically going to be the exact same thing. You're just going to start off with your buffs, open with an ultimate, so I still had stacks left over. So basically, whenever you're on your front bar, that's the only time you're ever going to be casting your bow proc. And every time you swap to your front bar, you recast Twisting Path, even if you have duration left on it. So right here, I would recast it. So static rotation ends up overcasting Twisting Path, and you're losing DPS because you might have bow procs happening while you're on your back bar. So you will lose a little bit of DPS, but it's a lot easier rotation to maintain. It is going to be slightly more draining on your Magicka because you're overcasting Twisting Path. But again, you're trading off simplicity of rotation for DPS. So, you know, you kind of pick and choose your battles there. So with all that in mind, we're going to now do a DPS test on a 6 billion dummy. So do keep in mind this is a dummy parse, so you know, we're not playing mechanics. This is just basically, in a raid you will be playing mechanics. You might need to have some time where the boss is invulnerable, or you might be running around avoiding certain mechanics. So this is not going to be truly reflective of an in-raid parse. Don't forget you also get things like orbs and other buffs like Alkosh and Torg's Infused Crusher. So this is not necessarily going to be representative of what you're going to be able to pull in a raid. This is just kind of a demonstration of your rotation if you are doing something and you don't have to play mechanics or things like that. So I will try to narrate throughout the rotation to kind of give you guys an idea of what's going on in my head as I'm doing my rotation. But because I do a dynamic rotation with the Magicka Nightblade, I might not be able to talk as much as I would like. So do bear that in mind, and I apologize in advance. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I always want to re-up it whenever it runs out. You can see I'm prioritizing my bow proc over maintaining my buffs. Oops. That was the wrong button. I generally, if I'm on my back bar and I see a bow proc coming, for example, if the counter is on 4 and I'm on my back bar, I'll swap over to my front bar to get the bow proc off. And then finish off my back bar applications if I still have dots I need to apply. So you can see here that the dynamic rotation requires a lot of bar swapping. So a dynamic rotation might not be best for every single player. So now for execute, I only maintain siphoning attacks, blockade, and path for me personally in execute. Now other Nightblades might use keep up crippling grasp as well. It's whatever you want to do. I like to keep it simple and just keep up blockade and twisting path. And I also don't use my bow proc because the bow proc actually does about as much damage as your execute does. So there's really no point in using the bow proc there. So there we have it. That is our parser there. So we can see there down on the combat metrics report, pulled 38.3k. And here we have it. So here's the combat metrics report here. So we can see that we did pretty well on maintaining our Merciless Resolve proc. We managed to get almost 100% uptime on Minor Berserk. That's pretty important. Let's see, siphoning attacks was a little bit of downtime, but that's fine. Weapon damage, enchant was up almost 70% of the time, which is a pretty good number, even though we weren't on our back bar for a quarter of the fight because we were in execute, so that's kind of what you want to shoot for there. As we can see, as a Nightblade, you definitely want to get a lot of light attacks in. Light attacks are very important for a Nightblade because that's how you get your Assassin's Will proc. So you can see here what I was saying about the bow proc and the impales. They pretty much do the exact same damage, so there's really no reason to use a bow proc. When you're on your execute phase, you might as well just keep using impale instead to kind of save yourself from using the bow proc, because the bow proc animation is actually a little bit slower compared to impale, so you do end up losing a little bit of DPS there. But light attacking, like I said, is the most important part of a Magicka Nightblade's rotation. You can see here 22% of my DPS came from light attacks. You can see here it's Crippling Grasp is probably the least important thing to keep up. You can see how low it is on the DPS chart compared to everything else, which is why I drop it during execute, and it's not a big deal if you aren't maintaining it during execute at all, because Path and Blockade combined do a lot more damage. They actually outparse Assassin's Will and Impale when you combine the two DPSs together. So that's it for this build video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.